Hello and welcome to this module about the processing of language. In today's lecture, we will try and understand the different processes by which we comprehend and produce language so that we can communicate meaningfully with each other. In another lecture, we have tried to understand the components of language like phonemes, morphemes, words, syntax and semantics. These components of language can roughly be likened to raw material that is available for processing before the final useful product is formed. These phonemes, words and sentences which are symbolic must be transformed into meaningful forms in order for us to be able to make sense of them. So, in this module, we will begin by examining how speech is perceived and try to understand if our brain processes speech in any special way as compared to other non-speech sounds. We will then try and understand how discourse is processed, and finally we will also understand how written language is processed through reading. So let us begin. Speech perception. If you have tried to learn a foreign language, in the early years of your training, you must have felt as though the native speakers of the language talk very fast. It may have been hard for you to understand films in that language. However, you have no difficulty in understanding shows and films in your own language, even if the speakers or the characters talk fast. Moreover, even if a film in your native language is played on a lower volume, or if some of the speech sounds are not clear, you can make out what the person is trying to say. We can also easily understand what a child is trying to say if the child is speaking in our native language, even if they cannot speak clearly. As you must already be guessing, there is something special in the way speech is perceived by our mind as compared to other sounds. It is a great wonder that while the human mind can understand only 2/3 of a phone per second of non-speech sounds, we can actually understand as many as 50 phonemes per second in a language in which we are fluent. When native speakers of a language speak, they co-articulate. That means that phonemes are articulated in an overlapping way. Before one phoneme has been pronounced completely, another is already being articulated. There is also a lot of overlap between words that are spoken in a sentence. Let us hear two sentences, one in which there is no co-articulation and the other where there is. Your booking code is 509888. Your booking code is 509888. The second sentence, which has a lot of co-articulation, feels more natural. Actually, co-articulation should make it much harder for us to perceive speech, but it doesn't. So how does the human mind understand speech? One category of theories say that the mind processes speech in a step-by-step manner. In an initial stage, the speech sounds are analyzed into their component parts, and then these component parts are analyzed for patterns which match with an already existing template in our mind. These theories thus look at speech perception as template matching or feature detection. One such theory is the phonetic refinement theory proposed by Pisoni and their colleagues in 1985. It says that we start with an analysis of auditory sensations and then shift to higher level processing. We hear a sound, we match it with a word that we already have in memory and thus understand speech. Another similar theory is the trace model given by McClelland and Ellman in 1986, which says that we perceive speech in three levels. First, the acoustic level, second, the level of phonemes, and finally the level of words. McClelland and Ellman say that speech perception is an interactive process. Higher levels of perception interact with lower levels and vice versa. For example, if you were to hear a sentence like, the ale was near the dash, wherein the first consonant sound in the place of the asterisk was unclear because of another disturbing sound in the background, and in the place of the blank you hear one of the following words, either tree or well or hammer. It is very likely that you will recall hearing the snail was near the tree, the pail was near the well, or the nail was near the hammer, which means that your mind inserts the missing phoneme depending upon the context of the sentence. There are other theories which propose that speech perception is a special process. Somehow our mind learns to overcome the effects of co-articulation and we perceive speech sounds as distinct from one another. Not only that, we do not perceive the difference in the pronunciation of the same phoneme in different words, but different phonemes are understood as categorically different from each other. Let us try and understand this with an example. The phoneme P is pronounced slightly differently by native English speakers when they say the word put than when they say the word lip. The P in put sounds more like P, whereas the P in lip sounds more like P, yet the P sound is perceived to be the same sound in both the words. In another experiment, researchers used a speech synthesizer to create a series of consonant vowel sounds so that the articulations progressively moved from ba to da to ga. The mixing of the sounds was such that there was only a slight increment of the next consonant sound in each sound as it progressed from ba to da to ga. People who listened to the series of sounds, however, did not notice these sounds as small incremental differences, rather they perceived a sudden switch. People could not distinguish between two neighboring bas, while the distinction between ba and a neighboring da was preserved. This categorical difference between two phonemes and the blurring of the acoustic difference between pronunciations of the same phoneme shows that speech perception is a highly specialized process. Let us now try to understand how discourse is perceived. First of all, let us consider what discourse is meant to accomplish. Searle in 1975 has identified 5 direct speech acts. That means that there are 5 things that speech aims to accomplish. These are: 1. Representative. It is a speech act by which a person conveys a belief that a given proposition is true. For example, Shivaji Maharaj was a great statesman, or this is the lowest temperature that Pune has experienced in the last 10 years. Second, directive, a speech act where a speaker attempts to ask a listener to do something. For example, please submit your assignments on Tuesday, or will you arrange these files properly? Directives can sometimes be framed as questions. For instance, what is the time like is actually seeking information. Third, commissive, a speech act wherein a speaker commits to engage in some future course of action is called a commissive. For example, I'll definitely pay you the rent by the 10th of this month, or I promise I'll finish my homework before going to bed tonight. Fourth, expressive. It is a speech act which shows the speaker's psychological state. I'm very anxious right now and so I'm unable to start my work, or I feel guilty saying all this. Fifth is a declaration. It is a speech act by which the very act of making a statement brings about an intended new state of affairs. For example, when a doctor says, "I'm sorry but the tumor is malignant and we will have to start treatment at the earliest," the very statement puts the patient in a new and changed state, in this case shocked or disturbed. Most speech can be classified into one of these 5 direct speech acts. However, sometimes requests are made more obliquely, not so directly, and these are called indirect speech acts. There are 4 ways of making indirect requests. 1. Asking or making statements about abilities. For example, can you show me the way to the passport office? Second, stating a desire. For example, I would be really grateful if you could give me an appointment for the coming week. Third, stating a future action. For instance, would you water the plants in the garden now? Fourth, citing reasons. For example, I need to know the truth. This statement is an indirect request to make the listener say the truth. There are also some conversational postulates that we follow while speaking. These are unwritten rules or cooperative principles that allow us to speak meaningfully to each other. Grice in 1967 has identified 4 maxims that people follow in order to make a conversation successful. These are: first, the maxim of quantity. While speaking, speakers should provide as much information as is required, but no more information than is appropriate. The best example of this is when someone asks us, how do you do? We are expected to give a brief answer like, I'm fine, thank you, how are you? And not give a detailed explanation of how we are. Second, the maxim of quality. The speaker's contribution to a conversation has to be truthful. Third is the maxim of relation. The speaker's contribution to a conversation should be relevant to the aims of the conversation. The speaker should not digress too much from the topic of the conversation or should not say things that are utterly irrelevant to the topic at hand. Fourth is the maxim of manner. The speaker should not be obscure or vague in their speech or make it too complicated for others to understand. Let us take a little break at this point. You will now see some examples on the screen. Please answer the question that follows each example. Example 1, the psychiatrist says, what do you remember about your father? And the patient answers, my father used to take me out to the beach. We once went out fishing. I go out fishing every other week. Last week I caught a cod. My friend had a small boat, doctor, red. It was red, newly painted. In this conversation, which maxim has the patient violated? The correct answer is, it is the maxim of relation that has been violated. Example 2, I feel very lost. Lost in the sense, I cannot make out where my life is going. I wonder why I am alive. In this conversation, what type of speech act is this? This is an expressive speech act. Example 3, would you mind if I exchange places with you in this queue? And the question is, what type of a speech act is this? This is an indirect speech act. Understanding sentences is a complex and challenging task. It seems that listeners pay attention to the syntactical structures of sentences while understanding their meaning. Jarvella in 1971 performed an experiment to understand how people process sentences, especially clauses within sentences. He presented participants with either of 2 paragraphs where there were interruptions in between, during which the participants were to recall as precisely as they could whatever they had heard of the sentence. A sample of 2 passages that Jarvella presented to the participants are shown here. The first example is, with this possibility, Taylor left the capital. After he had returned to Manhattan, he explained the offer to his wife. And the other paragraph was, Taylor did not reach a decision until after he had returned to Manhattan. He explained the offer to his wife. When participants were asked to recall these paragraphs, both groups were able to recall the first clause and the last clause with a similar level of accuracy. But for the middle clause, which is after he had returned to Manhattan, the group that saw the first paragraph could recall it significantly better than the group that saw the second paragraph. Why do you think this must have been so? According to Jarvella, this was because the first group was still holding the clause in working memory when they were asked to recall it because it belonged to the recentmost sentence. Whereas for the other group, since the clause belonged to an earlier sentence which they had already finished processing, they forgot the second clause. This proves that we do not understand sentences clause by clause. Rather, when we finish processing one sentence, our mind discards the exact words and retains only a gist of its meaning and moves on to the next sentence. Another intriguing phenomenon is the manner in which we resolve ambiguities as we understand speech. Ambiguities can be of many types. Here are three of them. The first is phonetic ambiguity. The financial year is different from the calendar year. This is an example. But if the words were to be broken down as the financial year is different from the calendar year, this would be an example of phonetic ambiguity. The second is lexical ambiguity, where that same word can have two meanings. An example is, he gave her a ring. A ring might mean an ornament or a telephone ring. Finally, we have syntactic ambiguity. Here, the fragments of these sentences are consistent with at least two different parses. For example, the burglar threatened the student with a knife. Here, the sentence might mean that the burglar used a knife to threaten the student, or the burglar threatened the student who was holding a knife. How does our mind resolve ambiguities? Research has proven that initially when we hear a sentence, all possible meanings of the words are available to us. They come to mind automatically. But within a fraction of a second, the moment the context is made available, only one or the correct meaning remains and others are suppressed. Most people manage to resolve the ambiguities with striking speed. And now finally, we come to this final section of this module where we are going to try and understand how we understand written material through reading. We know that some people are voracious readers. Avid readers can finish reading an entire novel in a day. On the other hand, there are people who have great difficulty in understanding written language. They may read and reread paragraphs, but may find it very difficult to make sense of written language. Reading involves many complex tasks. First, paying attention to the forms of the letters and words, then creating a corresponding sound. So, even if the reader is not reading aloud, they are producing subvocal speech and then being able to make sense out of the sentences. You must have observed that readers do not move their eyes in a continuous fashion over a text that they are reading, but that their eyes take momentary pauses at particular words and then rapidly move forward before taking a pause again. These pauses that readers make as they scan a text are called eye fixations. Just and Carpenter in 1987 have conducted a series of experiments about readers' eye fixations. Initially, they established that the average reader takes a pause of about 250 milliseconds and then a jump that lasts about 10 to 20 milliseconds. They assume that every time a reader encounters a new word, they try to interpret it immediately. This interpretation occurs during the time of the eye fixation. It is now easy to infer that the lesser the time taken for a fixation, the lesser is the difficulty with which the reader is interpreting every new word. In other words, the shorter the eye fixations, the better will be the reader's reading ability. While reading a text, the content words will receive longer eye fixations than function words such as a, on or the. This is understandable because the meaning of the text will be derived from semantically richer parts of the text. There are many other factors that also affect reading. One of them is how the sentences in a text are framed. If the sentences are framed in a complex manner with many propositions in one sentence, the reading and interpretation of the text will be more difficult. Another factor that influences reading speed and ease of interpretation is the relationship between the sentences in a text. Haviland and Clark in 1974 described the given new strategy that readers seem to use when understanding written text. This strategy means that readers divide sentences into two parts, one something that they know and two something that is newly presented in that sentence. Readers first attempt to interpret what they already know and then update it with whatever is new in the sentence. The process of making a connection between what is given or what the reader already knows and what is novel is called bridging inferences. It takes time for people to make these bridging inferences or connections, especially if the references in one part of the text are to something that has been said much earlier in the text. Bridging inferences would take a longer time. Think for a moment about any detective story or novel that you have read. The clues to a particular part of the story have appeared much earlier in the text. Readers continuously have to make these bridging inferences while reading a detective story. The ease with which readers are able to make these bridging inferences will determine how easily and how well they understand the plot. Finally, the reader's attention span is also a factor that determines reading speed and accuracy of interpretation, and also retention of the material that is read. As you can see, reading is a task that requires the reader to go beyond what is presented. They have to continuously make use of information that is already available to them and then understand new ideas. They have to understand a gist of the material that is read and store it in memory and pick out only that information which is relevant and important while filtering out unwanted details. And with all of this, we come to the end of our module on language comprehension and production. There is much more that can be explored about how humans use language, but it goes beyond the scope of the present lecture. Hope you have found this module interesting. Thank you.